when you're doing a survey, when you're commissioning a survey, when you're assessing a survey, and I know I say this all the time, this is the first question you have to ask, but certainly one of the first questions that you need to ask is, what's your assumption about the size of the electorate, and what percentage of the voting eligible population does your survey assume? There's a number of different methodologies that are used. One, and this sounds awfully dramatic, is called ask and terminate.
I'll be back.
We'll go through these in a little bit more detail in a second. Probable vote weights, there's then a hybrid of the two. There's then a probable vote weight with a cutoff, and then what we are seeing now is much more the case of registration-based sampling, when survey researchers are taking names off the voter file in which you know people's probability of voting, and then you are weighting the responses in your survey to people's probability of voting in the voter file. So how does ask and terminate work? And again, that sounds awfully dramatic, but typically ask and terminate will be comprised of a couple questions. Whereas you get somebody on the phone, or if you're doing the survey online, you get a respondent, and the first thing you do is you ask them whether they're registered to vote. And you try and phrase it in a way that makes it possible for them to say no, that doesn't make them feel so guilty if they say no. So here's a question that's often used. Some people are registered to vote and others are not. So, some people are registered to vote, others are not. Doesn't make you a bad person if you're not registered to vote. Now, of course, they don't actually say that, but trying to make it less socially desirable to say that you were registered. So if someone says yes, they're registered to vote, then they're going to go on to the next question. If they say no, they're not currently registered to vote, well, they're then typically asked a follow-up, which is, you're not registered to vote now, but do you have a plan to register to vote? And if someone says, no, I'm not registered and I have no plans, then they're, again, the dramatic word, terminated, not literally, but the interview is terminated. That's someone who they don't plan on registering, so they're not going to vote, so you don't want to talk to them, and you don't want to waste your valuable survey time and survey money talking to them. There's then another cutoff point, which is after you've determined that someone is registered to vote or plans to register to vote, you then ask them what their likelihood of voting is. And there's a number of different ways this question is asked. Are you definitely going to vote? Probably going to vote? Probably not going to vote? Definitely not going to vote? Sometimes they'll ask people to say, are you certainly going to vote, or is it only 50-50? In lots of academic surveys, typically ones asked both before the election and after the election, you might make this question a little bit softer. And so, for instance, on the National Election Study, the question phrasing is, sometimes things come up that make it not possible to vote. Were you able to vote, or did something came up that made it impossible for you to vote? Again, just hopefully making it easier for people to admit that they didn't vote if they in fact didn't vote, or easier to admit that they're not going to vote if in fact they do not plan on voting. But in this style, again, ask people, are you going to definitely vote, probably not going to vote, or definitely not going to vote? Those people who said they were registered or planned to register, but then tell the interviewer in this second question that they're probably not going to vote or definitely not going to vote, that interview is terminated, and they only interview people who say they are going to vote. That is probably the methodology that is used most prominently by political pollsters, and it's also used by a fair amount of media pollsters as well. Again, as an aside, I've sat through a lot of presentations and I've looked through a lot of media polls. Often there is not tremendous transparency on exactly how their probable vote models are being calculated, or their likely vote models are being calculated. So sometimes it's even hard to tell which of these different methodologies are being used. There's another message which is a weighting method, which is one that's used by CBS News, for example. And so what CBS does is they interview everybody, but then they ask a series of questions. Not only are you registered, or do you plan to register, or do you plan to vote, but they ask, have you voted in the past? Do you know where your precinct is? How interested are you in the campaign? Can you name the candidates?
Can you tell us which of these people is running for president?
Go with him.
That is Jorge Ramos, news anchor for Univision.
It's not a trick question. It's none of them.
It's none of them?
It's none of them.
It's that one.
And then using their experience from the past, they basically score everybody. So someone who says they're registered and they're definitely going to vote and they voted in every single previous election and they know who the candidates are and they're interested in the campaign, they would receive a higher probability of voting than someone who says they're not registered, they don't plan to register, they're not going to vote, they're not very interested, they don't know who the candidates are.
I'm going to guess this gentleman here.
Jerry Mathers. Senator Jerry Mathers from Beaverton, USA.
Okay.
What CBS assumes is, yeah, it's much more likely that that first person who knows what's going on and knows the candidates and is interested and plans to vote is going to vote, but it's not 100% they're going to vote. And it's actually not even 0% that person who says they are not likely to vote. But it just counts the person, and we'll talk about weighting, it counts the person who rates higher on these vote questions that are predictive of voting, gives that person more weight in the survey than someone who rates lower on all of these questions. Gallup uses a version of that, and it's actually a version I don't really love very much. Gallup does this when they did presidential polling. They got out of the business after 2012. And Pew does this as well, and I think Pew also has pretty much gotten out of the horse race game when it comes to election polls. What they do is they also ask a whole series of questions and give everybody a score, and then they rank everybody in terms of their likelihood of voting from highest to lowest. Unlike CBS, which then takes everybody's responses but counts those people who are going to vote, who they think are going to vote with a higher likelihood, they count them more. What Gallup and what I think Pew does is to then say what they think turnout's going to be. So if they assume that turnout's going to be 55% of the eligible population, after they rank everybody, you have your class rank, they rank everyone on their voting probability rank, they then take the top 55% or remove the bottom 45%. I don't like that so much because you're still giving people a probability, but you're giving everybody a probability of absolutely voting if they hit that cutoff, and everybody has zero probability of voting if they're below that cutoff. It depends a lot on whether you are able to estimate correctly what total turnout is going to be, which can be difficult. And even more problematic in my book is think about the person who just made it to their class rank, put them in the 55%, and the person who was just below in their class rank, put them in the 45%. In practical terms, the difference in probability, the difference in the likelihood of each of those people voting is extremely low, yet the person who just gets over the bar, makes the cut in the golf tournament, if you will, gets counted as completely voting, while the person who doesn't make the cut doesn't get counted at all. Why would you not want to do the CBS method that weights the responses of everybody? Well, the answer is it's because it's expensive to interview people, and then you're spending all this time, all this money to get someone and to interview them, and then if they actually have a very low probability of voting, you've spent a lot of money to get a result that's not going to have much of an impact on your final estimate. Why do you do ask and terminate? Because it's cheaper, it's easier. Boom, you terminate someone who says they're not going to vote. You don't spend the money to interview that person. So I've become a little bit of a fan of a hybrid method. So it's one where if someone says they're not going to vote, I believe them, and their interview is terminated. But someone who says they are going to vote, they're then asked additional questions. I count their responses, but I will weight down the responses of somebody who does not score as well on questions that tend to predict voting as does someone who scores pretty well on questions that tend to predict voting. We've talked a lot, and we're going to talk a lot about the voter file in the program and in the class. Another way that pollsters are trying to take into account probable electorates is to, or get good estimates of what turnout is likely going to be, is take as their sampling frame not just a list of numbers, but names from the voter file. So you take a random probability sample from the voter file, and then you've made a calculation of the likelihood that everyone's going to, that respondents are going to vote from their previous voting behavior, and you use that as a weight to weight the data on their probability of voting. That's a very interesting method, has a lot of strengths. The problem is often there's not a very high match rate between between the voter file and getting contact information where you can get a hold of somebody. And so if it's the case that Democrats or Republicans or young people or old people are more likely to have contact information on the voter file, then in practical terms, even though you took a random sample, the people who you're actually going to be able to contact, there's going to be a bias there. But that's also a bias that you'll be able to see once you pull the sample. So again, I know I always say this is the first thing you should look at, and you got a lot of first things to look at when it comes to survey research. A lot of questions you want to ask yourself and ask your pollster. But certainly, very high on the list is asking a pollster what their method of determining likely voters was and what impact that method had on the top line result.